The dust settled around his words like a burial shroud, each syllable carrying the weight of graves he'd never properly visited. She felt the calluses on his palm, rough as the bark of trees that had weathered too many storms, and understood that his hand was both an offering and a warning. In the fading light of the Arizona territory, where promises were as scarce as water and twice as precious, she held the hand of a man who spoke of children as if they were contracts, and hearts as if they were casualties of war. The widowed cowboy's eyes held the particular emptiness that comes not from never having loved, but from having loved so completely that the absence carved out canyons in a man's chest. His name carried weight in these parts, respect earned through years of keeping his word, when words were all a man had left. But she could see that beneath the reputation lived a ghost who had forgotten how to hope. Subscribe to witness a love story that dares to bloom in the wasteland of a broken heart. The porch creaked under their combined weight, a sound that had become as familiar to Martha as her own breathing, though tonight it seemed to echo with the finality of church bells. She had known this conversation would come, had seen it building in the way Samuel's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't watching. In the careful distance he maintained, even when they worked side by side, mending fences or tending to the horses that had become their shared responsibility since her husband's death 6 months prior. The evening air carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain, but all she could focus on was the tremor in his voice when he spoke of children, as if the very word might shatter something fragile inside his chest. His proposal hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, visible but impossible to grasp, and she found herself studying the lines etched deep around his eyes, wondering how many sunsets a man had to witness alone before he learned to speak of love as if it were a business transaction. The silence stretched until it became its own language, one they both understood, but neither dared to translate into words that might demand more than either was prepared to give. Samuel's hat rested on his knee, and she noticed how his fingers worried the brim, the same nervous gesture she'd observed during the funeral when he'd stood at the back of the church, a shadow among shadows, offering his presence as the only comfort he knew how to provide. The ranch stretched before them in the gathering dusk, 40 acres of stubborn earth that had demanded everything from her family and given back just enough to keep them breathing. And now it demanded a decision that felt too large for her heart to hold. She thought of her late husband's hands, softer than Samuel's, hands that had known books and gentle persuasion rather than rope and iron, and wondered if it was betrayal or survival that made her consider this man's offer. Samuel had been Thomas's friend, the kind of friend who appeared when cattle needed moving or roofs needed mending, who never stayed for supper but always ensured the work was done. And now he sat beside her, offering a future that felt both inevitable and impossible. The children he spoke of existed only in possibility, phantom lives that might carry his name, but would grow up in the shadow of a father whose heart lay buried with another woman, another life, another version of himself that had died in ways she was only beginning to understand. His honesty was brutal in its kindness, a gift wrapped in barbed wire that drew blood even as it offered protection, and she found herself grateful for the pain because it meant this moment was real, not another of the dreams that had sustained her through the long months of learning to be alone. The stars began their nightly emergence, pinpricks of light in a sky that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of everything she had ever known, and she realized that Samuel's presence beside her felt both foreign and familiar, like a song half-remembered from childhood. Martha's own hands had changed since Thomas's death, had grown harder and more certain, and as she looked at them now, she saw her mother's hands, her grandmother's hands, the hands of women who had learned that survival sometimes required accepting what was offered rather than waiting for what was desired. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of cattle settling for the night and the distant howl of something wild and lonely, and she thought about the particular courage it took for a man to offer his name while admitting his heart was beyond reach. Samuel had loved his first wife with the kind of devotion that left scars, the kind of love that poets wrote about and practical people learned to fear, and his honesty about its absence felt more intimate than any declaration of passion could have been. She had seen him at Margaret's grave, had watched him stand there for hours without moving, and understood that some wounds were too deep to heal, could only be managed like chronic pain that flared with changes in weather. The practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to calculate feed costs and water rights and the price of survival in a land that forgave nothing, recognized the wisdom in his proposal, the way it offered security without the dangerous vulnerability of hope. Yet something in her chest, something that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the way he had held her hand when he spoke of buried hearts, whispered that perhaps healing was not always about forgetting, but sometimes about learning to carry love in new ways. The memory of their first meeting surfaced unbidden 3 years ago at the church social, when Margaret was still alive, and Thomas still believed his cough was nothing more than dust from a dry summer. Samuel had been different then, quicker to smile, his laugh carrying across the yard like music, and she remembered thinking that Margaret was lucky to have found a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to questions he hadn't known he was asking. The transformation had been gradual at first, then sudden, the way a river changes course after a flood, and by the time Margaret was buried, Samuel had become someone else entirely. A man who moved through the world like a ghost, learning to inhabit flesh again. His proposal tonight was not born of love but of something more complex, a recognition that two broken people might create something whole, not through healing, but through the careful arrangement of their separate damages into a structure that could withstand the storms that had already proven they could destroy everything. She understood this because she had become someone else too, had learned that widowhood was not just the absence of a husband, but the presence of a different version of herself, one who could make decisions that would have terrified the woman she used to be. The ranch needed a man's strength, her future needed the security of a name that carried respect, and perhaps most importantly, she needed to stop waiting for a love that might never come and start building a life from the materials at hand. The sound of his breathing beside her was steady and patient, the rhythm of a man who had learned to wait without hoping, and she found herself matching her own breath to his, a synchronization that felt both accidental and inevitable. Samuel's presence had become a constant over the past months, not intrusive but reliable, like the sunrise or the evening star, and she realized that what he offered was not romance, but partnership, not passion, but the kind of steady companionship that could sustain two people through the long years ahead. His admission about his buried heart was not a warning but a gift, a promise that he would not ask her to compete with a ghost, would not expect her to fill a space that was already occupied by memory and grief. The children he spoke of would be real, would carry his name and her blood, would grow up understanding that love came in many forms, and that sometimes the most honest love was the kind that acknowledged its own limitations. She thought of the women in town who had remarried for love and found themselves disappointed when reality failed to match their dreams, and wondered if there was wisdom in choosing partnership over passion, security over the dangerous uncertainty of hope. The night air grew cooler, and she felt Samuel shift beside her, not moving away but settling deeper into the moment, and she understood that he was giving her time to decide, was offering his patience along with his name. As the last light faded from the western sky, Martha felt something shift inside her chest, not the flowering of love, but the quiet recognition of possibility, the understanding that sometimes the most important decisions were made not with the heart, but with the careful wisdom of experience. Samuel's hand still rested in hers, warm and solid and real, and she thought about the children who might one day run across this porch, who would know security, if not passion, stability, if not the wild joy of a love that consumed everything in its path. His buried heart was not a tragedy, but a fact, like the color of his eyes or the scars on his hands, and she found herself grateful for his honesty, for the way he had offered her a future without false promises or impossible expectations. The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a careless hand, and she realized that what Samuel offered was not everything, but it was enough, and perhaps in a world that had already taken so much, enough was its own kind of miracle. The weight of his words settled around them like a blanket, heavy but warm, and she squeezed his hand once, gently, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words could hold. The morning came with the particular clarity that follows a night of difficult decisions, the kind of light that seems to illuminate not just the landscape, but the hidden corners of the heart where truth lives alongside fear. Martha had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with phantom children who bore Samuel's strong jaw and her own stubborn chin, children who would grow up in a house built on honesty rather than illusion. And she woke with the strange sensation that her life had already begun to reshape itself around possibilities she had not yet spoken aloud. Samuel was already in the barn when she emerged from the house, his silhouette moving with the efficient grace of a man who had learned to find purpose in routine. And she watched him for a moment before approaching, noting how even his smallest gestures carried the weight of careful consideration. The horses nickered softly at her approach, and she realized that they had already accepted Samuel's presence as natural, had incorporated him into their understanding of safety and provision in ways that spoke to the quiet consistency of his character. His proposal hung between them like morning mist, visible but not yet solid, and she found herself studying his face for signs of regret or second thoughts, finding instead only the same patient steadiness that had drawn her to consider his offer in the first place. The work of the ranch continued around them, cattle needing water and fences requiring attention, but underneath the familiar rhythm of daily tasks lay the electric awareness that everything was about to change, that decisions made in darkness were about to be tested in the harsh light of day. Samuel looked up as she entered the barn, his eyes holding a question he was too careful to ask, and she understood that he was giving her the space to change her mind, to retreat from the precipice they had approached together in the safety of darkness. The smell of hay and leather and honest sweat filled the air between them, scents that had become as familiar as her own skin over the months of their careful partnership, and she realized that what they had built together was already more substantial than many marriages she had witnessed. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the horses' hooves, and she found herself watching the way he gentled the animals with touch and voice. The same combination of strength and tenderness he had shown when he spoke of the children who might one day call him father. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but expectant, like the moment before thunder when the air itself seems to hold its breath. And she understood that whatever words came next would determine not just their future, but the very shape of the people they would become. Martha had learned that some decisions could not be made with the mind alone, required the wisdom of the body and the quiet knowing that lived deeper than thought. And as she stood in the golden light filtering through the barn's weathered boards, she felt that deeper knowing rise to the surface like water from a well. The practical considerations that had occupied her thoughts through the long night seemed less important now than the simple fact of Samuel's presence, the way he inhabited space without demanding it, offered strength without expecting gratitude in return. The conversation, when it finally came, was quieter than either had expected, words spoken in the spaces between shared tasks, decisions emerging not through grand declarations, but through the gradual accumulation of small agreements. Samuel spoke of the house that would need expanding, of the room that could be added for the children who existed only in possibility, and Martha found herself nodding, already seeing the space in her mind's eye, already imagining the sound of small feet on wooden floors. His voice carried no false enthusiasm, only the careful planning of a man who had learned to build his life one deliberate choice at a time, and she appreciated the way he spoke of their future as a project to be undertaken together rather than a dream to be pursued. The morning light shifted as they worked, and she noticed how it caught the silver threading through his dark hair, how it highlighted the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind and the vast distances that defined this country. His hands, when they accidentally brushed hers as they worked, were warm and slightly rough, hands that knew how to coax life from reluctant soil and comfort from stubborn animals. And she found herself thinking that perhaps the children he spoke of would be fortunate to inherit such hands. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of something that had already begun, an acknowledgement that their lives had been moving toward this moment through all the months of careful friendship and mutual support. Martha's acceptance, when it came, was spoken in the same quiet tone Samuel had used for his proposal, words that carried the weight of commitment without the decoration of romance, and she saw something in his eyes shift and settle, like a man who had been holding his breath finally allowing himself to exhale. The relief in his face was not the joy of a man whose heart had been won, but the gratitude of someone who had been offered a second chance at building something meaningful from the ruins of what had come before. They stood together in the barn's golden light, two people who had learned that love came in many forms and that sometimes the most honest love was the kind that acknowledged its own boundaries, that promised partnership without pretending to offer what had already been given elsewhere. The horses moved restlessly in their stalls, sensing the change in the air, and Martha realized that even the animals understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful balance they had all maintained was about to be replaced by something more permanent and more complex. Samuel's hand found hers again, and this time the gesture felt different, not the tentative touch of a man making an offer, but the firm clasp of a partner sealing an agreement, and she understood that whatever came next would be built on this foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding. The morning was advancing, and there would be work to do, arrangements to make, a future to construct from the careful architecture of their combined strengths and acknowledged limitations. The practical details of their arrangement began to emerge as they worked side by side. Decisions about timing and ceremony, and the 100 small adjustments that would be required to merge two lives that had learned to function independently. Samuel spoke of the preacher in town, a man who understood that not all marriages were born of passion, who could perform a ceremony that honored commitment without demanding declarations that neither of them was prepared to make. Martha found herself thinking of her wedding dress, still hanging in the wardrobe upstairs, and wondered if it would be appropriate to wear it again, or if doing so would be a betrayal of the different kind of love she was choosing now. The children they had spoken of began to feel more real as they discussed the practical aspects of their care, the way Samuel's steady presence would provide security while her own fierce protectiveness would ensure they never doubted their worth. His buried heart was not an obstacle to overcome, but a fact to be incorporated into the structure of their life together, like a stone foundation that could not be moved but could be built upon. The morning light continued to shift and change, and Martha realized that she was no longer the same woman who had sat on the porch the night before, that acceptance had already begun to transform her into someone new, someone capable of choosing partnership over passion, security over the dangerous uncertainty of hope. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist, Martha felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, not the wild joy of a woman in love, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had made a decision that honored both her needs and her limitations. Samuel worked beside her with the same steady efficiency he had always shown, But there was something different in his posture now, a subtle relaxation that spoke of a burden shared rather than carried alone. The ranch stretched around them, 40 acres of stubborn earth that would now be tended by 4 hands instead of 2, and she realized that what they were building together was not a love story in the traditional sense, but something perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on honesty, respect, and the shared understanding that sometimes the most important promises were the ones that acknowledged what could not be given as clearly as what could. The day ahead would bring its own challenges and discoveries, but for now, in the golden light of morning, Martha allowed herself to feel something she had not experienced since Thomas's death, the quiet confidence that came from knowing she would not have to face whatever came next alone. Samuel's presence beside her was not the answer to all her questions, but it was enough, and in a world that had already taken so much, enough felt like its own kind of miracle. The morning came with the kind of silence that settles over a place where important words have been spoken, but not yet fully understood. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Samuel tend to the horses in the corral, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were handling something more fragile than leather and steel. The coffee in her cup had grown cold, but she held it anyway, needing something solid between her palms. Yesterday's conversation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, visible but untouchable, changing the shape of everything it touched. She had taken his hand, yes, but in the clear light of morning, she wondered if she had grasped salvation or simply another kind of sorrow. The children would wake soon, and with them would come the ordinary demands of the day. But Margaret knew that nothing would ever be quite ordinary again. Samuel's hat cast a shadow across his face as he worked, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he paused between tasks as if listening for something that might never come. He had offered her his name, his protection, his future, but had been honest about the one thing he could not give. Margaret understood the arithmetic of such arrangements better than most women her age. She had learned early that love was a luxury few could afford, and that survival often required accepting what was offered rather than waiting for what was desired. Yet something in the way he had spoken those words, the careful honesty of them, had touched a place in her heart she thought had been sealed away forever. She set down her cup and smoothed her skirts, preparing to step into whatever this new arrangement would demand of her, knowing that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The sound of Samuel's boots on the porch steps announced his approach, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Through the thin walls of the cabin, she could hear her children stirring, Thomas mumbling in his sleep, and little Sarah's soft cough that always came with the morning air. These sounds, so familiar and precious, reminded her of everything she stood to lose if she made the wrong choice, but also everything she might be able to protect if she chose wisely. Samuel knocked softly, a courtesy that spoke to his understanding of boundaries, and when she opened the door, she saw in his eyes the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt in her own chest. He held his hat in his hands, his hair slightly mussed from the wind, and for a moment he looked younger, more vulnerable, like a man asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. The space between them felt charged with possibility and danger, like the air before a summer storm. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, his voice lower than usual, as if he were afraid of waking the children, or perhaps afraid of the words themselves, "about what this would mean for all of us." Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let him enter, and as he passed her she caught the scent of leather and morning air that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He moved carefully through her small kitchen, his large frame somehow managing not to disturb the delicate order she had created in this space, and she realized that this consideration, this awareness of her domain, was perhaps the first real gift he had offered her. They sat across from each other at the wooden table her late husband had built, the same table where she had fed her children countless meals and made countless difficult decisions, and now it would witness this new chapter of her life. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated the grain of the wood between them, and Margaret found herself tracing its patterns with her eyes, as if the swirls and lines might reveal some hidden wisdom about the choice she was about to make. Samuel reached across the table not to take her hand, but to place something beside her cup, a small piece of paper folded carefully. "I wrote down some thoughts," he said, his cheeks coloring slightly, "about how we might arrange things, if you're willing." Margaret unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, surprised by the careful script that covered the page, the thoughtful way he had considered every aspect of their potential union. He had written about the children's education, about the division of labor on the ranch, about the financial arrangements that would ensure her security, but also about smaller things, how they might navigate the awkwardness of shared space, how they might build trust slowly, how they might honor both the memory of what they had lost and the possibility of what they might create together. Reading his words, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this man had thought not just about his own needs, but about hers, about her children's, about the delicate ecosystem of a family that was not quite a family, but might become something close to it. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the final lines, where Samuel had written about hope, not the wild, desperate hope of youth, but the quieter, more sustainable hope of people who had learned that happiness was not a destination, but a series of small, daily choices to build something worthwhile from whatever materials life had left them. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression so open and honest that it took her breath away, and she realized that somewhere in the space between his offer and her consideration, something had already begun to grow between them, something fragile but real, like the first green shoots that pushed through the earth after a long, hard winter. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning in the parlor of the preacher's house, with only the children as witnesses and Mrs. Henderson from the general store to sign the papers. Margaret wore her best dress, the blue one with the tiny pearl buttons that had been her mother's, and Samuel had somehow procured a small bouquet of wild flowers that he pressed into her hands with the solemnity of a man handling something sacred. The ceremony itself was brief, the words familiar but strange when applied to their particular circumstances, and when the preacher asked if they would love and honor each other, Margaret felt the weight of the promise they were actually making. Not to love, perhaps, but to try, to build something honest and good from the careful foundation of mutual respect and shared need. Thomas stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers, with a fierceness that spoke to his understanding that this moment was changing everything, while Sarah clung to her skirts, too young to understand the words, but old enough to sense their importance. When Samuel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady, but she could feel the slight tremor in his touch that revealed his own nervousness, his own awareness that they were stepping into uncharted territory together. After the ceremony, they walked back to what was now their shared home, the children running ahead while Margaret and Samuel followed at a more measured pace, both of them seeming to understand that this transition required careful handling. The ranch looked different somehow, as if the legal binding of their lives had altered the very landscape, making it both more familiar and more foreign at the same time. Samuel carried her small suitcase, the one that contained everything she owned, beyond what was already in the cabin, and the sight of it in his hands made the reality of their situation suddenly, startlingly concrete. They were married now, bound by law and custom and the promises they had made, but they were also still strangers in many ways, two people who had agreed to share a life without yet knowing what shape that life would take. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of small decisions and careful negotiations, the delicate work of learning to exist in the same space without stepping on each other's tender places. Inside the cabin, Margaret moved through the familiar motions of preparing dinner, but everything felt different with Samuel's presence filling the space, his careful attention to her movements, his obvious desire to help coupled with his uncertainty about what help she might want or need. He sat at the table with Thomas, helping the boy with his letters, and Margaret found herself stealing glances at them, surprised by how naturally Samuel seemed to understand her son's particular way of learning, his need for patience and encouragement rather than pressure. Sarah, initially shy, had gradually warmed to Samuel's quiet presence, and now she sat beside him, showing him her collection of smooth stones and listening with rapt attention as he told her stories about the different places he had found similar treasures. Watching them together, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of worry she hadn't even realized she was carrying about how her children would adapt to this new arrangement, this man who was now, legally and practically, their stepfather. The evening meal passed with surprising ease, the conversation flowing around practical matters, plans for the next day's work, decisions about the children's schooling, small domestic arrangements that needed to be settled. Samuel praised her cooking with genuine appreciation, and Margaret found herself pleased by his obvious enjoyment of the simple meal she had prepared. There was something deeply satisfying about feeding someone who understood the value of good food, who didn't take for granted the work that went into creating comfort and nourishment from basic ingredients. After dinner, Samuel helped clear the table without being asked, his movements careful and respectful in her kitchen space, and Margaret realized that this consideration, this awareness of boundaries and roles, might be the foundation upon which they could build something lasting. The children, exhausted by the excitement and emotion of the day, went to bed without their usual protests, and suddenly Margaret and Samuel found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife, the weight of that new reality settling around them like evening shadows. They sat together on the porch as the sun set, not touching but close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth radiating from Samuel's body, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness, with the knowledge that they were now bound together in ways that would require them to navigate new territories of intimacy and distance, closeness and independence. Samuel spoke first, his voice soft in the gathering darkness, telling her about his plans for expanding the vegetable garden, about his hopes for the ranch's future, about the small improvements he wanted to make to ensure her comfort and the children's security. Margaret listened, offering her own thoughts and suggestions, and gradually she began to understand that this was how they would build their life together. Through these careful conversations, these shared plans and mutual considerations, the slow accumulation of trust and understanding that might, in time, grow into something deeper than either of them dared to hope for now. When it came time to retire for the evening, they had already discussed the sleeping arrangements. Samuel would take the small room that had served as storage, while Margaret kept the bedroom she had shared with her late husband. The practicality of this arrangement did not diminish its emotional complexity, and as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the strange intimacy of sharing a home with someone who was both familiar and unknown, someone who had promised to protect and provide for her, but who remained in many ways a mystery. Through the thin walls, she could hear Samuel moving quietly in his room, the soft sounds of a man trying not to disturb the peace of the household, and she realized that this consideration, this awareness of her need for space and time to adjust, was perhaps the greatest gift he could have given her on this first night of their married life. 3 weeks into their marriage, Margaret discovered that Samuel talked to the horses in a voice she had never heard him use with people, gentle, almost musical, full of a tenderness that made her pause in her work to listen. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard him in the corral, murmuring to the old mare about her sore hoof, his words carrying on the morning breeze like a prayer or a lullaby. There was something in that voice that spoke to a part of him he kept carefully hidden from the world, a softness that made Margaret understand why the animals trusted him so completely, why they moved toward him rather than away when he approached. She found herself wondering what it would feel like to be spoken to in that voice, to be the recipient of such gentle attention, and the thought surprised her with its intensity, its sudden longing for something she had convinced herself she didn't need. The sheet she was hanging fluttered in the wind, and she gripped it tighter, as if it might anchor her to the practical realities of her life and away from these dangerous territories of want and possibility. Their days had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and carefully constructed, like a dance where both partners were still learning the steps, but had begun to trust that the other would not deliberately cause them to stumble. Samuel rose before dawn to tend to the animals and check the fences, while Margaret prepared breakfast and woke the children, and by the time he returned to the cabin, the coffee was ready and the table was set with the kind of care that spoke to her understanding that small gestures could carry large meanings. They ate together in comfortable quiet, planning the day's work, discussing the children's needs, sharing observations about the weather and the land with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to value each other's opinions. Thomas had begun following Samuel around the ranch whenever his chores were finished, absorbing lessons about animal care and land management with the hungry attention of a boy who had been missing a father's guidance, while Sarah had claimed Samuel as her personal audience for the elaborate stories she invented about her dolls and their adventures. The transformation in her children had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of their new arrangement. Thomas, who had been withdrawn and anxious since his father's death, had begun to smile again, his shoulders losing the tense set that had made him look like a small man carrying burdens too heavy for his years. Samuel never tried to replace the boy's father, but he offered something equally valuable: steady presence, patient instruction, and the kind of quiet confidence that helped Thomas begin to believe in his own capabilities again. Sarah, always more resilient, had simply absorbed Samuel into her world with the adaptability of childhood. But Margaret could see that having a man's attention, his gentle teasing and genuine interest in her thoughts, was filling a need the little girl hadn't even known she had. Watching her children flourish under Samuel's care, Margaret felt a gratitude so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes, a recognition that he was giving her family something precious beyond the mere security she had originally sought. The physical space of their shared life had evolved as well, with Samuel's belongings gradually finding places among her own, his books appearing on the shelf beside hers, his coat hanging next to her shawl by the door. These small integrations felt significant in ways that surprised Margaret, as if each shared space was a tiny declaration of their commitment to making this arrangement work, to building something lasting from their careful beginning. Samuel had asked permission before making any changes, no matter how small, and his respect for her domain, for the home she had created and maintained, had touched something deep in her heart. When he built new shelves for the kitchen to hold her growing collection of preserves, when he repaired the loose board on the porch steps without being asked, when he brought her wildflowers for the table simply because he thought they might please her, Margaret began to understand that his care for her was not just duty or obligation, but something more complex and genuine. One evening, as they sat together mending clothes by lamplight, Samuel began to tell her about his life before he came to their valley, about the places he had traveled and the work he had done, the loneliness that had driven him from town to town until he found this place that felt like home. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he were offering her something fragile and valuable, and Margaret realized that this sharing of history, this gradual revelation of the experiences that had shaped him, was his way of building intimacy without demanding more than she was ready to give. She found herself responding with her own stories, memories of her childhood, her dreams for her children's futures, the fears that kept her awake at night, and gradually the space between them began to fill with understanding, with the kind of knowledge that comes not from passion, but from the patient work of truly seeing another person. The lamplight flickered across their faces as they worked and talked, and Margaret thought that this quiet companionship, this shared purpose, this growing trust, might be its own kind of love, different from what she had known before, but no less valuable for its careful, deliberate construction. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice the way Samuel looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, an expression of such careful tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat. There was longing in that look, yes, but also patience, a willingness to wait for whatever she might be able to offer him, whenever she might be ready to offer it. She had expected their marriage to be a business arrangement, a practical solution to mutual needs, but she was beginning to understand that Samuel's heart, despite his careful words about burial and unavailability, was not as closed as he had claimed. The realization both thrilled and terrified her, opening possibilities she had not dared to consider, suggesting that their careful construction might be building towards something neither of them had quite expected when they first shook hands on this arrangement that was supposed to be about survival rather than hope.